Greetings, you beautiful people, and welcome to Mingled Waters. My name is Matthew Beal, and I'm so glad you found me. I'm a licensed counselor and spiritually integrative psychotherapist with 15 years of experience helping people with problems like trauma, depression, anxiety, grief, and relationship problems, and the challenges of navigating a complex and often difficult world. I also have a PhD in practical theology with a focus on the intersection of psychology and theology, and decades of experience in pastoral leadership, preaching, and teaching within a wide variety of church contexts and academic contexts. Please call me Matt. In Mingled Waters, I plan to explore a range of issues related to the intersection of three important streams of our shared relational existence: the teeming, troubled, and often chaotic depths of psychology, politics, and theology. I'm honored you're here, so please don't forget to smash like and subscribe or its equivalent on whatever platform you use, and let's dive in. Today I'm sharing thoughts on what the most recent presidential election might reveal about the importance of narrative and the death of God. Like many people, the last U.S. presidential election has left me reeling in body, mind, and spirit. I was baffled enough that Trump won his first term. The shock of that helped me reinterpret U.S. culture, particularly as I saw my Black friends and communities comparatively unfazed. They expressed recognition, saying that this was relatively unsurprising in the America that they knew, the America that overpoliced them, jailed them disproportionately, the America of Jim Crow and "but I have a Black friend" and "we don't see color," the America that kills them with impunity because a police officer or hostile civilian can always claim they feared for their life. While I initially saw the election of Trump as a senseless violation of American values, they saw a predictable expression of those values. Because of their testimony, I was somewhat more prepared for Trump's second election, but still shocked and dismayed, honestly. Now I can't help but wonder, how could this have happened? What the absolute is wrong with us that we would manifest what amounts to malignant ignorance, tolerance of hate and division, and self-injurious stupidity, in my interpretation of it? While an extensive postmortem of the election is beyond my scope here, one thing became clear to me immediately after Kamala Harris's loss. One of Democrats' more significant failures, I believe, relates to narrative. We need to learn how to tell a better story. And I'd like to explore that failure today from a theological perspective, which I find particularly important in light of the fact that a significant majority of Trump's support comes from white evangelicals and conservative Christians. These are my people, in a sense, so though I'd reject those labels for myself, I still grieve and I wonder. I'm confident the Democrats were correct in their narrative that Trump is a danger to more marginalized people and to democracy itself. This is a reasonable interpretation of his rhetoric, his agenda, and I, for one, am angry at him and at his enablers for the trajectory his first few weeks have already set, which really is the worst of all he's promised. He is proving an alarmist narrative accurate. In my anger, however, there's a moral check, a cautious hesitancy. I recognize that it's likely most of those who voted for him didn't do so out of malice or with anti-democratic intent. I can see how, for some, Trump's rhetoric proved strangely compelling. In part, he had made such outlandish promises and used such hyperbolically inhumane rhetoric that some people voted for him because they didn't believe he even intended to keep some of his campaign promises. More to the point, though, is that he crafted a sense of narrative out of his demonic message of isolationism and rugged independence, circling the wagons against a specter of existential threat by non-white immigrants. He drew his listeners into identification with a superior and innately good us, contrasted with an inferior, unclean, and malicious, and innately bad them. An us not so subtly dominated by stereotypically white, masculine, cis-het characteristics. And for those who wonder, Cishet refers to cisgender and heterosexuals, cishet, not transgender and not gay, basically. That said, many of his enablers deserve explicit judgment. Some portion of his supporters knew precisely how harmful, racist, patriarchal, and destructive his agenda was. The avowed Nazis, Proud Boys, and aspiring fascists among his enablers deserve no quarter whatsoever. But a more significant portion, without being so directly atrocious, are nevertheless shamefully complicit. They could have and should have known better. They didn't. Their craven compliance is folly and sin that will almost certainly result in terrible harm. It already has, in fact, and this harm will only increase. Some of those who voted for him, however, were less directly implicit. They were drawn into a well-crafted narrative, a story promoted and leveraged by those in power. This was Trump's story, though it has never been original to him. He tapped into a narrative vein, a vulnerability deeply embedded within the American heart, soul, and body and culture. This narrative is certainly not indicative of any true brilliance. He's no genius, let alone a stable one. Rather, he happened to find himself and his unique aptitudes situated at a demonically fortuitous intersection, a perfect storm of converging fronts. The first storm front is his radical narcissism, probably exacerbated by the second front, a degree of privilege that very few have enjoyed. Together, these fostered a sense of entitlement that's nearly absolute. The third front is the social context of backlash against the progress made by feminism, Black liberation, and queer advocacy. Trump arose on the heels of our first Black president and the legalization of gay marriage, and in the wake of Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. All the socially prophetic developments that infuriated many on the right and raised eyebrows of concern among moderates. Lest things be taken too far, right? Questionable things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's crucial to note that Trump's resurgence relied on leveraging the economic frustrations of a post-pandemic, mid-recession world. This frustration was shared widely, including by some of those who benefited most from the past decade of social progress. Trump made significant inroads, for instance, among Hispanic and Black men. Throughout Biden's presidency, Trump and his MAGA enablers fanned economic frustration into flames with a constant barrage of propaganda and misinformation. His narrative consisted largely of manipulative rhetoric and bald-faced lies, but much of the population was vulnerable to believing his brand of deception, particularly as it was supported by partisan right-wing media and foreign bot farms, which are waves of fake social media accounts used to help spread misinformation. His deception was also operative at a more subtle level, almost constantly. A rhetorical flourish, a lingering emphasis, dog whistles many couldn't or wouldn't hear, especially white people, or an offense so extreme that people could write it off as hyperbole. His was a story that drew people in. I've been drawn in many times myself in a variety of ways. Some of the narratives that have drawn me in and informed me were life-giving, while many were problematic or even destructive. I'm in the midst of such stories and all their ambiguities even now. We all are. To be human is, in part, to be constituted of and formed by the myriad narratives swirling around us. To borrow from St. Paul and Paul Ricoeur a little bit, we live, move, and have our being within narratives. What moves me now to write is not Trump's horrendous rhetoric and deception, though I am disturbed by that and committed to resistance in word and deed. Nor am I moved to write by my frustration that Democrats can't seem to craft a compelling story. Instead, relying on blunt critique, facts and figures, a critical exegesis of Republican rhetoric that shows it to be xenophobic, racist, misogynistic, ableist, classist, etc. Accurate as that critique is, it proved insufficient at a crucial watershed moment. And it is not my focus, at least not right now. Similarly, I am disappointed in my own struggle to craft a compelling narrative to support the insights I'm gleaning from the brilliance of those working, speaking, and writing from the margins of society. A friend recently helped me realize that my narrative failure was pretty significant in that regard. And though it troubled my ego quite deeply, I realize I have failed in my resistance to sufficiently care about narrative. Narrative identity was even an important aspect of my doctoral dissertation. So, how could I have failed so badly in this? Certainly, I'm not a complete narrative failure, but I neglect it so easily. I've been a poor storyteller, and I'm disappointed in myself for that. These are important problems. Trump's narrative was strangely compelling but faithless and harmful. The Democratic Party has largely failed to craft a compelling narrative, and so have I. All of these are entwined and they matter. Right now, though, I find myself most concerned at the narrative failure in the white church. Trump was elected overwhelmingly by white Christians, white conservative Christians. Sure, he managed to shift the needle more than anyone expected among black men and even won among Hispanic men by 1 point over Harris. Nevertheless, his victory came primarily through the overwhelming support of white Christian conservative men and women, particularly evangelicals. So I find myself wondering, how is it that the white church has been so uniquely vulnerable to a narrative so counter to the gospel, the good news that in Jesus, God is extending the grace of love and redemption to all? And more specifically, God is reaching to the poor, the oppressed, the vulnerable, to those othered by the powers that be, to lift them into a kingdom, to borrow a word coined by Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, a kingdom of liberation, empowerment, acceptance, and radical hospitality. This gospel inherently fosters a social ethic that prioritizes the very same people, the stranger, the poor, the oppressed, the outcast, the victims of injustice. Many of us could and therefore should have known better than to support a moral fiend like Trump, whose rhetoric and policies stand in stark contrast to this understanding of the gospel. Most of us in white Christian faith communities, simply by virtue of being people allegedly transformed by this gospel, should easily recognize how utterly and pervasively Trump's narrative stands in opposition to a gospel-centric approach to faith and politics informed by that faith. Our founding story paints a radically different picture. The story of Jesus. What are we to make of this? What the just happened? I think it goes back to interpreting our founding narrative, the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and its significance, the gospel, the good news of the inbreaking kingdom of God. In white Christians, Trump found not only a vulnerability, but a primed readiness and practiced habit of accepting a problematic narrative. His narrative is dominated by values, ethics, and policies distinctly at odds with a faithful understanding of the gospel and Christian social ethics. White Christianity's vulnerability to Trump is rooted in our impoverished understanding of the gospel itself, a vulnerability particularly evident in white evangelicalism. This is poverty not uniquely our own. It has a millennia-long history. It reaches back at least to Constantine. We might even trace it back further to Paul's epistle to the Galatians, though certainly the church was vulnerable to Constantine's empire for similar reasons. In the letter to the Galatians, Paul goes so far as to sardonically express his preference for a total phallic emasculation because of the inclination among a faction within the church to occupy a place of privilege while marginalizing others through identity-based social hierarchies. The Galatians' hierarchy was that of privileging those who accepted circumcision over those who were uncircumcised. Later, in the 4th century CE, the Common Era, under Constantine, the gospel became not good news for the poor and oppressed, but a way to concentrate and manipulate power for the aims of empire. Multitudes, in subordination to the pressure or even compulsion of empire, found self-preservation or self-interest a compelling reason to convert, assenting to the gospel as it was interpreted under empire. In the 2024 election cycle, we see this play out similarly. Concerns about the economy and immigration dominated people's motives at the polls. Money and otherness. Mammon and the stranger. More money, safety from strangers. Accumulation and exclusion. Rather than circumcision, however, our hierarchies are built primarily on factors like race, gender, and economic status. Either way, we find a radical dualism at work. In the American gospel, there's no need for an integration of kingdom and world. The kingdom is heaven, some other place, elsewhere, elsewhen. This leaves our present home to the whims and furies of those most privileged within the complex web of power relations. The effect is that the gospel is chained and led into servitude, just as it was in Galatia. But in our context, it's enslaved to the whims of white patriarchal Christian nationalism and a bastardized anti-baptism of shame, frankly. There are many reasons this deprivation and bastardization of the gospel scares, saddens, and angers me. Among them is the impact this has on our political landscape. For instance, it results in mass deportations and the untold suffering and trauma that xenophobia inevitably inflicts. It also threatens the important protection of both church and state from intruding upon one another, a lesson it seems humanity is only willing to learn the hard way. And because it is a false gospel, its followers are thereby exhumed from the waters of their own baptism, led away from Jesus' call to die with him and serve others, led with hooks in their noses into the Babylon of power over the othered, into walled fortresses in which the exclusionary us is safe from the other, free to monstrify, vilify, and demonize the other, safe from the demands of love, of radical hospitality, and of death to self, safe from the resurrection's promise of a pervasive unity within the beauty of diversity, safely isolated from what Julian of Norwich called oneing with God and creation. It saddens me for another reason as well, which brings me to my main point. This corrupted gospel and its social ills maim the church's witness in the world by throttling its liberative work and conveying a distorted vision of God. The church's work and witness are its representation of the divine, its testimony to the love of God. And under this distorted gospel, rather than God being love and the ultimacy of love serving as the interpretive key to all else about God, God's dominant characteristic becomes power, particularly the power to insist on certain behavior and belief, and to inflict justice on wrong behavior or belief. Justice in this theological framework refers to punitive or retributive justice. That's justice viewed as punishing wrongdoing. Punitive justice asks, what sort of punishment is appropriate for this wrongdoing? Appropriate punishment in this theology can reach from, the proverbial slap on the wrist, up to the divine retribution of everlasting conscious bodily torture in eternal hellfire. Fun. These days, the human expression of punitive justice often equates to varying amounts of jail time, after which one might hear the common saying that the wrongdoer has, quote, paid their debt to society. The punishment apparently rights the wrong. It satisfies the demands of justice. This punitive vision stands in contrast to the principles and values of restorative justice, which is an approach to justice that asks very different questions. Rather than what punishment is appropriate for wrong behavior, restorative justice asks, what steps are most conducive to healing all those involved in a harmful experience, including the victims and the perpetrators, as well as their families, communities, and institutions affected by this harm? I like thinking of it as asking, how can love work its healing throughout everything affected by this harm? Justice as punishment not only tends to ignore the needs and desires of victims, what does jail time do for most victims, right? But not to mention that it leaves out their communities. Historically, it also produces a theological conundrum. How can God be loving and yet punish sinners in wrath? A host of theologians have attempted to answer this. Some of those are admirable attempts to promote love within a given theological tradition, while others are little more than contortions. Anselm of Canterbury, for instance, wrestled with the paradox of how can God be the unmoved mover and yet actively love, which requires movement, action on behalf of the beloved. Anselm asked how God could be compassionate or moved, yet passionless, unmoved. One of my favorite theologians, Catherine Keller, notes that, quote, one may read much of theological history as a conscious and convoluted attempt to compress the warming intuition that God is love into the cold, hard diamond of divine immutability, end quote. Divine immutability being the attribute of God being unchanged, unmoved. Anselm tried to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between God as passionless within God's self and God as compassionate in our experience of God. I find that not only somewhat convoluted, but definitively unhelpful. Moreover, this vision of God tends to produce its own image in human relations. As theologian and philosopher Richard Carney put it, despotic theology leads directly to despotic theocracy. Tyrannical gods breed tyrannical humans, and vice versa. And lo and behold, we now face the imminent threat of white Christian nationalism's theocratic tyranny and its despotic patriarchal theology, with its punitive, unmoved God and its punitive, unmoved racism, misogyny, xenophobia, and homophobia, transphobia, and on and on. We already see its fruit in dispassionate mass deportations, growing economic insecurity, anti-environmental priorities, the shutdown of USAID's vital humanitarian work across the globe, which incidentally affects a host of those on the mission field, the Christian mission field. Trump's white Christian enablers seem unmoved in the face of such suffering, just like their unmoved mover. I side instead with a phrase popular in process philosophy and theology that celebrates God not as the unmoved mover, but as the most moved mover. With that important distinction in mind, let me now circle back to a narrative that I find cruciformly hopeful in the midst of this chaotic administration and period of history. I say cruciformly hopeful because it's not a simple hope, not simply an optimistic, emotional glow. It's hopeful in a way similar to the hope found in the crucifixion. And I draw my understanding of this cruciform hope from a particular book by Joseph R. Winters, Hope Draped in Black. Winters centers Black experience to resist the myth that the election of Barack Obama proved the U.S. had become a post-racist society. He proposes that for hope to have any real value, it must constantly wrestle with the ambiguity between progress and loss, trauma, and melancholy. Our current loss, trauma, and melancholy are those inflicted by a white church that installed a felon, fool, and aspiring tyrant as president. Can hope shine through this toxic fog? Perhaps, but first we must honestly face the danger, harm, and grief. I propose that one way to identify the loss inflicted by white Christianity's support of Trump is as the death of God. We have, in a sense, put God to death through the very evil of this witness. That to which the white church bears witness is nothing less than our very own deicide, the murder of God. I'm speaking poetically, of course, and I hope prophetically. God is no more dead and no less alive than ever before, though life and death are metaphors when applied to God. But now more than ever, we can echo Friedrich Nietzsche's famous saying, God is dead. Please bear with me, though, as Nietzsche's phrase is well known and generally quite badly misunderstood by both evangelicals and the quasi-philosophers who haven't really read Nietzsche for themselves or haven't read him well. So closer attention to one version of his numerous uses of that phrase is worthwhile. In his book, The Gay Science, which is not about homosexuality, but it's also translated as The Joyful Wisdom, right? The Gay Science. Nietzsche represents his philosophical insights through the figure of a raving madman. The apparent madman, himself an atheist, enters a village of atheists who are unaware that their atheism comes at a significant cost. He enters the village crying out, "I seek God! I seek God!" While the atheistic population looks at him, laughing in derision, he raves on. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers, the holiest and the mightiest thing in the world, the mightiest thing the world has ever possessed, has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood from us? His listeners fall silent. Nietzsche is referencing the loss of any foundation for metaphysics and universals. The citizens of the city seem ignorant of the impact their atheism has upon these foundational aspects of Western civilization. They blunder on, blindly assuming that universal norms can continue unchanged. Like Trent Reznor's more recent lyrics in the industrial rock band 9 Inch Nails, God is dead and no one cares. Nietzsche's madman, however, sees the impending decomposition of this dead God and mourns, aware that some deep magic is lost, and that the effects of this loss will be both unpredictable and significant. Okay, pardon me as I nerd out for a moment, but this reminds me of an aspect of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings that highlights for me the gravity of victory in its complex relationship with loss. For those who don't know the story, it's an epic tale in which the least likely hero, an insignificant small hobbit named Frodo, saves the world of Middle-earth from utter devastation by the increasingly powerful Sauron. Centuries before the events in the book and the movie, Sauron had appeared as a benevolent figure and created rings of power for the people of Middle-earth, 7 for the dwarf lords and 9 for the rulers among men, among humans. What they failed to realize until too late was that Sauron also created a master ring, the one ring to rule them all, to rule all the other rings, and through them to enslave their wearers to his own evil will. When Middle-earth's inhabitants realize Sauron's deception, a great battle ensues. The One Ring is lost, and most thought that Sauron could never again rise to power. In secret, however, he grew, and the One Ring fell first into the hands of Gollum, whom it addicted, tortured, and deformed. Eventually, it slipped away from Gollum into the hands of the hobbit Bilbo. His nephew Frodo later inherited the ring and agreed to bear it to the only place it could be destroyed, the volcano Mount Doom in Sauron's wasteland empire of Mordor. Despite Frodo's almost inevitable addiction to the ring and his eventual refusal to destroy it, a fight with Gollum at the volcano's edge resulted in its destruction and Sauron's total defeat. Though this is lost in Peter Jackson's film adaptations, in the novels, the destruction of the One Ring is not only a victory, it's also a grievous loss. The beauty and power of Middle-earth was due largely to 3 elven rings, rings that were not crafted or corrupted by Sauron, or subject to his One Ring, yet they were crafted by means of the knowledge Sauron had given to the elves, and were thus dependent on the One Ring, in a manner Tolkien actually never fleshes out. Thus, when the One Ring was destroyed, the elven rings and all their glorious benefit to Middle-earth were also lost. Together, these 3 rings made Middle-earth what it was in that age, kindling fire and courage in the hearts of its inhabitants, protecting and preserving them in their battle against tyranny, and making its beauty and power flourish. In the destruction of the One Ring, the glory of Middle-earth began fading, and the elves gradually were forced to migrate from its shores. I find the parallels rather striking. Just before Nietzsche's madman utters his most famous cry, he asks a series of questions about this murder of God. How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon? What were we doing when we unchained the earth from the sun? His questions reach their climax as he asks, do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Like the destruction of the One Ring, the divine death we encounter now has already begun a decomposition of significant cost. I suspect that there's been a theistically funded magic working unchecked behind the scenes in Western civilization, despite the fact that white Christianity has also done great harm. I see this magic, for instance, in the dawn of the sciences, with medicine extending lifespans into the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Education as a human right, the power of all men are created equal, the progress of feminism and the civil rights movement, and increasing attention to liberation and indigenous spiritualities and theologies, among other things. These all have roots deeply entangled with the teachings of Jesus, Christian social ethics, a theism of love, and the conviction that a created universe must have identifiable physical laws that can be studied to further human knowledge. Certainly, credit for such developments can't be limited to theistic influence, but as Western civilization has its modes of being, for better and worse, rooted in Christian thought and practice, I suggest it would be hard to deny its influence in much of the beauty and power of our society. At the same time, white Christianity and its God have wrought terrible evils upon the world, not least of them chattel slavery, misogyny, unfettered capitalism, and fundamentalism's regressive tendencies. The God of white Christianity has proven too readily available to endorse violence, oppression, colonializing destruction, and the unequal distribution of punitive justice. In the re-election of Trump, we see the death of God, that is, the death of white Christianity's witness to God, as this God is exposed as little more than a guise for the unadulterated pursuit of white male power, wealth, and domination. Recognition of this likely comes with mixed emotions. That such a God should die is cause for joy among those who care for the God revealed in Jesus' life teachings, death, and resurrection. Yet this death has come at the cost of electing an antichrist, that is, a false savior, who will extract even greater costs in his tyranny. It also comes at the cost of multitudes who might have seen and heard the good news of a God who is love, now understandably turning away from any hint of Christianity. Sadly, rather than seeing this death for what it is, rather than grieving the cost of this death and celebrating its potential hope, many fit neatly into Resner's observation that God is dead and no one cares. Truly, a shocking number of white Christians celebrate this not as a death, but as a theocratic ascension. Yet even for those who recognize this death and grieve the stench of its decay, it may be difficult to see how deicide of such consequence is also a victory. I suggest that this death is an answer to an ancient prayer that might pave the way to new resurrections. In the 13th and 14th centuries of the Common Era, a German friar, professor, theologian, and mystic named Meister Eckhart prayed a strange prayer: God, rid me of God. Eckhart's paradoxical prayer is rooted in apophatic theology, which is the ascending mystical path of unsaying all that can be said of God, since all speech of God is but metaphor, so that God beyond conception might apprehend the soul in love. I'm co-opting this prayer now in a similar vein, but a distinct historical application. May this God, the God of the mystics and saints and martyrs, the true God of true God, who is love, God of mystery, emanating glory, of such perfection and radiance that only unimpeachable darkness could convey while forever hiding this God. May this God rid us of white Christian God and its carcinogenic gospel, that we may, quote, know the love that surpasses knowledge, as Scripture says. Deliver us into the God of glory draped in utter blackness, revealed in thick darkness and the meager flesh of a teenage pregnancy among an occupied people, a despised minority who had known both slavery and deliverance, and an ancient Jim Crow of marginalization. God, rid us of God, of white Christian God. Perhaps you are among those able to see this death, smell its decomposition, and wonder with Nietzsche's madman, what, after all, are these churches now if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God? Certainly, white Christianity will not yield to this death easily. It will continue bound to the white Christian God and its impotent gospel, like the ancient death sentence of nupta cadavera, marriage to a corpse, a living person bound to a dead body until the spreading decay joins them both in death. The ancient poet Virgil depicted this punishment in verse. The living and the dead, at his command, were coupled face to face and hand to hand, till choked with stench in loathed embraces tied, the lingering wretches pined away and died. Perhaps following a resurrected God of love will rescue a host of those bound yet to a dead and decaying God. Perhaps a vibrant discipleship to the resurrected author of a living gospel of love could even rescue a nation from its chains to this corpse and its white God Christian nationalism. The Democratic Party is certainly no savior in this regard, though overall I find its tenor and policy much more amenable to a gospel-centered ethic. The Democratic Party desperately needs work, prophetic challenge, and change. And Democrats definitely need to craft a better story. So please understand, I'm not equating the Democratic Party or Democrats with the gospel or justifying any of the very real problems that arise regularly within that party. Nor would I deny that good, at times even much good, has come from Republicans, the Republican Party, or even evangelicalism. Nevertheless, at this juncture in history, their foundation has crumbled, and their God is dead. My point, however, is that the church needs a better understanding of the gospel if there's to be a resurrection after this death. If the very God of very God is to emerge in place of the putrid corpse of white Murica God. Importantly, this better understanding of the gospel will come primarily by listening to those more marginalized by the dominant white male power brokers of church and society. If the data on voting is to teach us anything, chief among those who seem to know better, maybe know a better gospel even, those who clearly knew better than to elect a con man, felon, and aspiring tyrant, were non-white women, those who identify as LGBTQ, and Jewish voters. Black women, LGBTQ voters, American Jews, were most strongly against Trump, with Latin American, Asian American, and Native American women also showing strong resistance. One lesson I draw from this is that if the church is to resurrect a gospel worth entrusting our very souls to, we must draw our understanding of it from the queer and minority feminist perspectives, from the inheritors of generational trauma, those who have been unjustly forced into impossibilities of resilience and resistance by the systems, institutions, and cultures of white men. And if the U.S. is ever to be rescued from the mass grave into which we have fallen, Those who know better must construct a more effective narrative from this foundation. I don't have all the answers. Far from it. Far from it. I am on a journey of much needed learning myself. But in my next podcast, I plan to explore a more faithful gospel arising from more marginalized perspectives. I'll lean particularly on James Cone's Black theology, LaRhonda Welch Little's womanist soteriology, and Marcella Alphas Reed's queer theology. Together, these empower us to consider how such a resurrected, non-white gospel and God can foster a wide-ranging liberation, human flourishing, and a Christian social ethic more faithful to the founding narratives of the Christian faith, and more beneficial to a pluralistic society. I hope you'll join me again. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Much love to you, my friends.